When the doors of Ravenscroft Manor were forced open on the morning of June 18th, 1863, the bride was already dead. She lay sprawled across the gallery tiles in her wedding gown, the veil torn as though ripped by unseen hands, her lips dark with berry wine, and a perfect ring of salt drawn around her body as though some desperate watcher had tried to contain what had already escaped. The guests who were meant to gather would never arrive. The bells of St. Mabin's would never ring. The celebration that was to unite two families had instead birthed a silence so heavy it choked the manor for decades to come. From that moment onward, the Harrow family forbade her name from being spoken aloud, forbade servants from whispering even the smallest detail, and scrubbed her from the ledgers of their history. To them she was gone, erased, as though she had never been. But the villagers remembered. They remembered the scream in the night, the stillness of the sea the morning she was found, and the candle flames that guttered inside Ravenscroft when no hand was there to tend them. And they remembered how her body was never right, not from the very moment it was discovered. This is the story they tried to bury, the story of the Pale Bride of Ravenscroft, a wedding that never was, and a haunting that never left. Before I begin, please subscribe to the Macabre Record channel and tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from. Now, let us unearth what history tried to erase. The summer of 1863 should have brought light and laughter to the Cornish coast, but instead it brought the kind of darkness that does not roll in with the tide, but rather seeps from the stones themselves. Ravenscroft Manor stood high on the cliffs like a great black sentinel, its windows staring outward at the restless waters below. For generations the Harrows had lived there, a family as stern and unyielding as the rocks on which their home was built. They were known for wealth, for their vast tracts of land and their iron will, but also for something else, something spoken of only when the wind was high and the doors were bolted. It was said that Ravenscroft swallowed its brides, that joy could not survive long inside those walls, and that every wedding held there ended in mourning before the vows could be completed. Few dared to repeat such things within earshot of the Harrows, but the rumours travelled like smoke, curling their way into every tavern, every chapel pew, every fisherman's hut along the coast. And when Elisabeth Harrow was found lifeless in her bridal gown, those whispers swelled into certainty. Ravenscroft had claimed another bride, and the curse of the Harrows had lived again. Cornwall in 1863 was a land both beautiful and brutal. The cliffs that guarded its coast were jagged walls of stone, black and slick with the spray of the sea, cliffs that could swallow a man in a heartbeat should he misplace his footing. Below, the tide surged and clawed like a restless animal, smashing itself against rock with an anger that seemed eternal. Villages clung to the headlands like nests of sparrows, weather-beaten, huddled close, their roofs smoking with peat fires that kept back both the chill and the silence. But even against this stark backdrop, Ravenscroft Manor was something apart, a house whispered of as though it were not quite of the living world. It loomed on the cliff's edge like a fortress built not to guard but to contain, its walls damp with centuries of storms, its chimneys coughing out smoke as though the house itself were alive. For years it had been a place where the poor avoided passing after dusk, where mothers pulled their children close when its windows lit at night, and where whispers of tragedy were bound to its very stones. The Harrow family held power, and power in those days was not easily questioned. They controlled land, wages, and law, and their name opened doors across Cornwall. But beneath the polished surface of their lineage, there ran a darker current. In taverns, old men spoke of brides who entered Ravenscroft and never left as wives. There were tales of ceremonies postponed without reason, of coffins lowered into the earth with shocking haste, of feasts turned suddenly to funerals. Few dared commit such suspicions to paper, for the Harrows punished slander harshly. But the stories were remembered in the mouths of the villagers and carried down through the years. Some said the house was cursed by the sea, that it demanded offerings in exchange for the Harrows' prosperity, and that it would not allow their brides to live long enough to bring joy into the bloodline. Others believed it was the family itself, steeped in secrets and ancient pacts, who saw to it that no woman's voice could echo through Ravenscroft's halls for long. Whatever the truth, the curse had become a quiet certainty, a shadow so deeply woven into the family's story that to speak of Ravenscroft was to also speak of its dead. When Elisabeth Harrow was born, her cries filled the cliffs with hope, for she was the youngest of the Harrows and the one believed to finally break the chain. She was spirited, bright-eyed, and loved even beyond the house that raised her. Villagers who caught sight of her walking the paths said she seemed untouched by the gloom of the manor, as if the sea itself softened when she approached. And when her engagement to Thomas Day was announced, it was whispered that perhaps at last the Harrows would be free, that a marriage of love rather than arrangement could heal what had been cursed for generations. But Ravenscroft was a house that remembered its debts, and the sea below its cliffs had not yet finished taking. Elisabeth Harrow was said to be unlike the others of her blood. Where her family was cold and stern, she carried a warmth that disarmed even the most suspicious villager. Her eyes were a deep grey, storm-coloured yet gentle, and her laughter carried across the cliffs like a bell that the sea itself dared not silence. She grew up in Ravenscroft Manor, but unlike her elders, she did not hide behind its walls. She walked the paths to the village, lingered among the market stalls, and spoke kindly with fishermen's wives and children. For many, she was a contradiction. The daughter of a house whispered to be cursed, yet a girl who seemed to carry the promise of a future that might be different. When she was seen on the arm of Thomas Day, hope spread even wider. Thomas was no Harrow by blood. He was a merchant's son from Devon, practical, ambitious, and with a reputation for honesty. He and Elisabeth had met at a gathering 2 years earlier, and their affection had grown not from arrangement or convenience, but from genuine fondness. That was rare in families like the Harrows, where marriages were often transactions of land and power. In Thomas, Elisabeth had found both tenderness and escape, and in Elisabeth, Thomas had found a light to cut through the fog of Ravenscroft's reputation. To the villagers, their union promised change, the possibility that love might be strong enough to silence whatever darkness had held the family for generations. Yet those closest to Elisabeth began to notice something unsettling in the months leading to the wedding. Servants spoke of her sleeplessness, of nights when her footsteps echoed along the gallery, at hours when no one else stirred. More than once, she was found standing in her bridal gown before the long mirror in her chamber, veil drawn across her face, lips moving as though in prayer or conversation, though no one was there to answer her. When questioned, she dismissed it with a laugh, saying she dreamed too often of the day to come. But her laughter rang hollow at times, as if it masked a fear she could not confess. Her letters to Thomas in those weeks survive only in fragments, but those fragments speak volumes. One, smudged as though by damp hands, reads, "I sometimes feel the house does not want me to leave. It calls me back even when I step into the garden. Promise me, Thomas, promise me that love will not let me slip away." He wrote back with words of comfort, telling her that walls and windows could not bind her, that soon they would be free together. But she never seemed entirely convinced. Those who looked into her eyes in her final days said they saw not only anticipation, but a shadow of dread, as though she knew the vow she longed to take might also be the vow that would cost her life. In the final week before the wedding, Ravenscroft grew restless, as though the very stones of the house were aware of what was approaching. Servants later spoke of the unease that spread through the halls, an unease they could not explain. Elisabeth was seen less in the village and more within the manor, her walks outside replaced by endless pacing in the gallery and on the staircase. At night, her chamber windows glowed with lamplight until dawn, and those who passed in the corridors swore they heard her voice behind the locked door, speaking in hushed tones as though to someone unseen. On more than one occasion she was found wandering in her gown. The garment, white and heavy with lace, had been laid out by the seamstress weeks before, but Elisabeth seemed unable to resist slipping it on. Mrs. Murch, the old housekeeper, recalled entering the north room one morning to find the young bride standing barefoot in the middle of the floor, her veil drawn, her lips moving soundlessly as she traced a circle of salt with her toe. When the housekeeper asked what she was doing, Elisabeth answered only, "Keeping it out." She refused to explain further. Fragments of her diary that survived the years reveal even more. One passage, dated June the 10th, just 8 days before her death, reads, "Dreams grow heavier. The sea is in the stairs. I wake with salt on my tongue and the veil already drawn across my face. I fear I am walking while I sleep. I fear I am not alone when I wake." Another, only 2 days later. "They say a bride must not look upon her gown at night. But when I do not, I cannot breathe. The glass in my chamber fills with faces I do not know. Some weep, some laugh. One leans close to mine and tells me I will never leave Ravenscroft." Servants reported that Agnes Harrow, Elisabeth's aunt, had begun keeping close watch over her niece. Agnes was a woman known for severity, but in those days her severity grew sharper, as if she were battling something no one else could see. She ordered bowls of salt kept near the doors, and instructed that no mirror be left uncovered after dark. To some she explained these precautions as old customs, protective charms handed down through generations of Harrows. To others she offered no explanation at all, only a warning. Do not cross the salt. Do not call her name after midnight. By then, even the villagers could sense something was wrong. Fishermen returning before dawn said the manor lights burned as if the house had no sleep, as if it waited. Some claimed they saw Elisabeth at her window, staring toward the sea, her veil drawn, motionless for hours. The wedding was only 3 days away, yet the air around Ravenscroft was not filled with the joy of an expected celebration. It was filled with a silence that pressed like a weight, the silence of a house preparing to keep what it had already decided was its own. On the night of June 17th, 1863, Ravenscroft Manor did not sleep. Servants would later say they felt something in the air, a pressure, as though the walls themselves were listening. The house was dressed for a wedding, garlands already hung, candelabras polished, and the great hall prepared for a feast. Yet in the hours before midnight, all that could be heard was the sighing of the sea below the cliffs, and the faint creak of boards as Elisabeth paced the gallery once more in her gown. Some swore they heard her laughter echo faintly, but it was not laughter of joy. It was strained, brittle, and cracked like porcelain under pressure. Shortly after midnight, a scream tore through the house. It was described by those who heard it as something between human and inhuman, sharp enough to still the heart, and thin enough to slip through every keyhole and under every door. Servants rushed to the source, but none dared enter the gallery until Agnes Harrow herself commanded it. When the doors were forced open, the sight inside turned breath to stone. Elisabeth lay upon the cold tiles, her veil twisted across her face, her lips stained dark with the remnants of the wine she had drunk at supper, her eyes wide open as though staring at something no one else could see. Around her body lay a ring of salt so perfect it might have been drawn by an unseen hand in those final moments. The physician summoned to the manor spoke quickly of fever. It was, he insisted, a sudden collapse, an ailment that sometimes seized the young without warning. But none could explain the salt. No one confessed to placing it, and yet it glistened unmistakably on the floor, an unbroken circle about her pale form. To break it, Agnes ordered, would be folly. "Leave her where she lies until the priest comes," she said. Her voice carried the weight of command, and no one questioned her. Thomas Day was denied entry. He had arrived at Ravenscroft earlier that night, hoping for one last word with his bride-to-be, but was turned away at the threshold by Agnes herself. When the news was given to him, he fought to enter, demanding to see Elisabeth, to hold her, to convince himself she yet lived. But the doors were barred, and he was told only that the wedding was off, that fever had stolen her before the vows could be spoken. His cries carried across the cliffs until dawn, a sound that even the sea could not drown. By morning the veil had been torn from Elisabeth's head and nailed to the front door of Ravenscroft, a symbol Agnes claimed was necessary to ward off what she would not name. To the villagers, it was a proclamation of tragedy, a sign that the curse of Ravenscroft had claimed another victim. Whispers spread quickly. Elisabeth Harrow had not simply died. She had been taken. And what had taken her, the villagers warned, was still inside the house. By dawn, Ravenscroft was a house under command. Agnes Harrow had assumed control with a severity that brooked no hesitation. Servants who had witnessed the scene in the gallery were separated, questioned, and silenced. They were warned that their wages and even their homes depended on their discretion. Some were dismissed outright and sent into the village with no pay, their silence purchased by fear. The word fever was fixed to Elisabeth's death like a label, repeated by every member of the household until it became not a truth but a requirement. The family would not tolerate another version of events. Thomas Day, the groom who had lost his bride on the eve of his wedding, was turned away once more. He pleaded to see her body, begged to lay one final hand upon her, but Agnes refused. "You will remember her as she was," she told him. "You will not see what she has become." Some say Thomas fell to his knees upon the steps of the manor, clutching the railings as though to pull the entire house down upon himself. But Ravenscroft did not yield. Its doors closed to him, and he was left alone in the pale light of morning, a man-made widower without ever having been husband. Inside the house, windows were boarded shut. Curtains were drawn. Mirrors, once polished in preparation for the wedding, were veiled in black cloth. Bowls of salt were placed at thresholds and stairways, some say by Agnes, others by Mrs. Murch, the old housekeeper who knew the family's rituals better than anyone. The air of celebration that had filled Ravenscroft only days before was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. The harp in the drawing-room was covered, the flowers withered in their vases, and the tables remained set for a feast no one would ever eat. The villagers, barred from entering, began to speak more openly. They recalled how the sea had lain strangely still the morning after Elisabeth's death, as though listening. They spoke of the gulls that had abandoned the cliffs entirely, a silence as unnatural as the scream they had heard from within the manor. They whispered that Ravenscroft had taken its price again, that the house did not allow its daughters to leave, and that Elisabeth had been marked long before she ever walked in her gown. Still, the Harrows held to their version. The physician signed his name to a cause of death he did not believe, and the priest was summoned for a funeral to be conducted quickly, without ceremony, without guests beyond the family. What was meant to be the grandest celebration of the decade would instead be a burial done in haste, as though the family could cover the truth as quickly as they covered her coffin. Ravenscroft had become not a house of mourning, but a fortress against scandal, sealing its windows and its secret is in equal measure. The night before the burial, Ravenscroft kept vigil. In Cornwall, it was custom that the dead not be left alone in the hours between death and interment, and so the family gathered in the chapel that clung to the cliff edge like a barnacle to stone. It was a place already heavy with shadow, its narrow windows gazing out to the sea, its floor uneven from centuries of damp. Elisabeth's body was laid out upon a bier of cedar, dressed still in her wedding gown, her veil restored, and her hands folded upon her chest. 4 candles burned at her head and 4 at her feet, and around the bier a ring of salt was carefully drawn, glistening pale against the dark stone floor. The Harrows took turns in silence, keeping watch. Yet silence was not what filled the chapel that night. Servants would later whisper of faint sounds rising from the coffin chamber. A rustling, as though of lace shifting. A soft exhalation, too human to be dismissed as the sea wind. Mrs. Murch, the housekeeper, swore she heard the faint scrape of fingernails on wood, though she dared not say so aloud until years had passed. Agnes Harrow sat nearest to the bier, her knitting needles clicking steadily, as if the rhythm alone kept the silence at bay. She muttered under her breath, words none could make out, but all agreed her lips never stopped moving, not even once. No outsiders were permitted at the vigil. The villagers who carried gossip were kept at a distance, though some crept near the chapel walls, hoping to glimpse or hear what the family tried to contain. One fisherman's boy later claimed he saw candlelight flickering wildly through the chapel windows, though there had been no wind that night. Another claimed he heard crying that did not sound like grief, but like pleading, as though the bride were asking to be released from her circle of salt. As the hours passed, the air in the chapel grew colder, heavy with a dampness that clung to the lungs. Some of the younger Harrows complained they could not breathe, but Agnes silenced them with a sharp glance. When the watch passed to Thomas Day, who had been reluctantly permitted 1 hour, he sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the woman he loved but could not reach. Servants later said his lips moved as if in prayer, though whether he prayed for her soul or for his own sanity, no one could say. What they did say, in voices hushed and trembling, was that the bride was not at rest. When the dawn came, the salt was swept and renewed. Agnes ordered that no one touch the veil, and that the bier be carried swiftly to the grave. But those who had sat through the night knew the truth. Elisabeth had not been silent. And a silence forced is never the same as peace. In the weeks that followed Elisabeth's burial, Ravenscroft Manor did not return to the rhythms of mourning. Grief is supposed to fade into silence, into the soft murmur of prayers and the rustle of black crape. But the manor was restless, as though it refused to let her death pass into memory. Chiokun Tumbai. The first signs came in the windows. Villagers walking the cliff paths swore that long after midnight, the windows of the gallery and the north wing were lit with candlelight. They claimed the flames did not flicker as ordinary fire would, but glowed steady and pale, as though they were lit from within by something not of this earth. The Harrow family denied it, yet even their own servants whispered that candles were burning themselves down to stubs with no hand to strike the match. Inside, the atmosphere turned heavy and watchful. Servants began to leave one by one, some without their wages, some without even collecting their clothes. They told stories of footsteps crossing the gallery at night, of the faint drag of fabric like a gown sweeping the stairs, of mirrors clouding with breath when no one stood before them. One chambermaid, pale with fear, swore that she saw Elisabeth's reflection in the hall mirror, her veil drawn and her lips parted, though when she turned, there was no one in the corridor. Agnes Harrow dismissed these tales as foolishness, but her own actions betrayed her. She ordered more salt to be laid at the thresholds, had entire mirrors removed from the manor, and forbade the servants from speaking Elisabeth's name after dark. Thomas Day, broken with grief, lingered still upon the cliffs, staring toward the manor as though his gaze alone could draw her back. He was seen calling her name in the night. His voice carried on the wind, his face gaunt and hollow. More than one villager claimed to see him looking upward toward the gallery, where the pale figure of a woman seemed to stand, unmoving, as though watching him. They swore she wore her wedding gown, her veil pale as frost, and that when Thomas reached out his hand toward her, the light in the window vanished all at once. Agnes took to the role of keeper of the house, moving through Ravenscroft with the authority of one who knew more than she would ever confess. She claimed the family was cursed by gossip, not by spirits, but her orders grew stranger with each passing day. Bowls of water were set in the gallery, sprigs of heather nailed above door frames, and prayers half in Latin and half in a language no one recognized were whispered as she passed. The villagers whispered that Agnes was less a protector than a jailer, not keeping spirits out, but keeping something else in. Ravenscroft had swallowed its bride, they said, and the house would not let go so easily. Thomas Day was a man undone. To lose a bride on the eve of marriage was grief enough, but to be shut out of her death, to be denied even the sight of her still form, was a cruelty that broke him. He remained in Cornwall long after most expected him to return home. He rented a small room in the village, though he spent little time within its walls. Most nights he wandered the cliff paths, staring toward Ravenscroft, calling her name into the dark. The villagers pitied him at first, then began to fear him, for his eyes took on the look of a man who no longer belonged to the living. Rumours spread quickly. Some said Thomas swore he had seen Elisabeth after her burial, standing in the gallery window, her veil drawn across her face, her hand pressed to the glass. Others said he confessed to hearing her voice in the wind, calling to him, begging him not to forget. One fisherman claimed Thomas stumbled into the harbour at dawn, clothes wet and hair dripping with salt, saying he had followed her into the sea, but she had vanished before he could reach her. Whether truth or madness, his words only deepened the villagers' conviction that the bride was not truly gone. Letters believed to be written by Thomas survive in fragments, though none were ever sent. In one, his script frantic and uneven, he wrote, "They lie when they say she is beneath the earth. I saw her last night, her veil lifted by no hand of wind. She looked at me as though she still waited, as though the vows had not yet been broken. If she calls again, I will answer, even if it is the house itself that speaks." Another, left unfinished, read, "The salt does not hold her, it only angers her. I must see her with my own eyes." It was not long before Thomas tried. Servants of Ravenscroft whispered that he had forced his way to the manor one storm-lashed night, pounding on the doors, demanding entry. He was discovered at dawn, lying unconscious at the base of the chapel steps, his clothes soaked through, his skin clammy as if he had been pulled from the sea. No wave had touched him, yet salt crusted his lips and eyelashes. When he woke, he spoke little of what he had seen, but he clutched at the air as though holding someone who was no longer there. Agnes ordered him turned away once more, warning that if he returned again, he would be dealt with harshly. But Thomas would not leave. He lingered on the cliffs day after day, his eyes fixed on the windows of the manor. Some swore they saw two figures there at night, one seated, one standing, her veil a pale shimmer in the dark. To Thomas, it was proof enough. To the villagers, it was confirmation of what they already feared. The Pale Bride of Ravenscroft had not been laid to rest. It was in the weeks after the funeral that fragments of Elisabeth Harrow's diary came to light. Some said a chambermaid smuggled the book out before fleeing Ravenscroft for good, unwilling to endure another night within its walls. Others believed Agnes herself allowed it to slip into the village, a warning of sorts, or perhaps a burden too heavy to keep. However it was found, its pages became the most haunting testimony of all, for they seemed to foretell the fate that had befallen her. The early entries were ordinary, filled with the chatter of a young woman preparing for marriage, notes on lace fittings, descriptions of her excitement, even sketches of flowers she hoped to carry on the day. But as the weeks drew closer to June, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew heavier, as if pressed into the paper with increasing desperation. One entry read, "The house will not let me leave. When I step into the garden, I feel it pulling me back. At night when I sleep, I wake already dressed in my gown, as though it has chosen me before I have chosen it." Another followed days later. I dreamed of the chapel. The candles burned low, and there was no priest, only mirrors upon the walls. In each mirror stood a bride, but none of them were me. They looked at me with empty eyes and begged me to join them. Her last surviving entries are the most unsettling. "The veil is heavy when I wear it at night. It does not feel like cloth, but like water pressing against my face. Sometimes I cannot breathe. Sometimes I hear whispers inside it, too soft to understand. Yet I know they are not my own. Agnes warns me not to touch the salt. She says it is the only thing that keeps me safe. But I wonder, is it safety or imprisonment?" The very final entry, scrawled and incomplete, reads only, "It comes tonight. I hear it on the stairs. If I do not write again, know that I tried to—" The line trails off into a jagged smear, as though the pen was ripped from her hand. To the villagers, the diary confirmed what they had long suspected, that Ravenscroft was not simply cursed but deliberate, a place where generations of brides had been claimed, bound, or silenced. To others, it was a record of a woman descending into madness, her mind unraveling under the weight of fear and isolation. But even those skeptics could not explain how she had described the salt circle before it was ever seen around her body, nor the veil pressed like water against her face, echoing the way her lips were found, dark, drowned, as though she had swallowed the sea itself. The diary vanished soon after, its pages scattered or destroyed, perhaps by the Harrows themselves. Only fragments remain, passed from hand to trembling hand. But those fragments were enough to etch her fate forever into the memory of Cornwall, and to seal Elisabeth Harrow as more than a bride. She became a warning. Long before Elisabeth Harrow walked the halls of Ravenscroft in her bridal gown, the family had already earned a reputation for sorrow. The Harrows were an old Cornish line, their roots sunk deep into the cliffs, their wealth tied to shipping, tin and land. They were powerful enough to silence gossip, but power cannot erase memory, and memory has a way of surviving in whispers. The villagers knew the stories. They knew of Harriet Harrow, who in 1792 was found lifeless in her gown on the very morning she was to wed. They knew of Margaret, who vanished 2 days before her vows in 1814, her veil discovered tangled in the branches of a hawthorn tree near the cliffs. They knew of Clara, who in 1839 collapsed at the altar itself, her body cold before the priest could finish the first blessing. The Harrows explained each away with words like fever, fainting, misfortune. But the pattern was too precise, too cruel, for any villager to mistake it as coincidence. Some said it was the house itself that demanded its price. Ravenscroft had stood since the 1600s, its stones blackened with centuries of storms, its foundations sunk into soil that often slid toward the sea. It was whispered that the manor had been built upon an older ground, a site where the ancient Cornish once made offerings to appease the restless tides. They offered lambs, some said, and sometimes daughters. Over the years, the house had inherited the hunger of the earth beneath it, and no Harrow bride would be permitted to leave its walls unclaimed. Others insisted it was the bloodline itself. The Harrows, they believed, had struck bargains long forgotten, bargains that brought them wealth while demanding the joy of their daughters in return. Agnes Harrow herself, stern and unyielding, was thought to know more than she admitted. Villagers claimed she kept books bound in cracked leather, records of every bride lost to the family, each name written in a hand not her own. When asked, she would say only that Ravenscroft was a house with duties, and duties once accepted cannot be broken without ruin. The sea, too, was part of the legend. Fishermen swore that whenever a Harrow bride died, the waters below the cliffs turned calm, as if the waves themselves had ceased their endless gnashing. On those days no gulls wheeled above, and the air held a stillness too complete to be natural. To those who lived near the cliffs, this was proof enough. The sea took what it was owed, and the Harrows supplied it. Elisabeth had been only the latest offering, the most beautiful and tragic of them all. By the time of her death, the curse of Ravenscroft was already spoken of as fact. It was said that no wedding would ever succeed within those walls, that no bride could wear her gown without sealing her fate. And now, with Elisabeth Harrow laid in the earth, the villagers whispered that the house had grown restless again, and that one day soon it would call for another. The villagers of Cornwall did not need official records to tell them what had happened at Ravenscroft. They carried the memory themselves, passing it from mouth to mouth like a secret too heavy to swallow. In the weeks after Elisabeth's burial, stories spread across the coast with the speed of the tide. Fishermen returning before dawn claimed to see a pale figure upon the cliffs, her gown trailing behind her, her veil lifted by no breeze. Some swore she leaned outward over the sea, as though listening for something beneath the waves. Others claimed she vanished the moment they called out, dissolving into mist before their eyes. To the villagers, it was proof that Elisabeth Harrow had not gone to rest but lingered still, bound to Ravenscroft and the waters below it. A carriage driver, who often carried goods to the manor, told a tale that chilled the town. He refused to take his horse near the gates after dusk, for one night he heard footsteps pacing the gravel road, though no figure could be seen. The sound was followed by a low, dragging noise, as if a train of lace swept the ground behind. When he turned his carriage lamps toward the noise, the footsteps stopped, and the night grew so silent he swore his own breath was stolen from him. He never drove the route again, even when offered double his fee. Children, too, picked up the whispers and made them into cruel rhymes. In the schoolyard they sang, "Bride in white, lost at night, Ravenscroft keeps her tight." Another rhyme was harsher still. "Salt on the floor, nail the veil to the door, the bride won't leave any more." Parents scolded them for repeating such things, but the words spread nonetheless, turning Elisabeth's tragedy into a chant that seemed to echo wherever children gathered. Even in the village taverns, grown men lowered their voices when the subject arose. Some swore they had seen a glow in the north window, a candle that never burned out, and a figure watching from behind the glass. Others said they had heard crying drifting across the fields on nights when the air was still, a sound so thin and sharp it pierced the ear like a needle. A few even claimed they saw two figures walking the cliffs together. The pale bride and a man beside her, believed to be Thomas Day, though Thomas was still very much alive, hollowed and wandering, a man who looked less of flesh and more of shadow with each passing day. The villagers feared Ravenscroft more deeply than ever. It was no longer just a house with a curse. It had become a place where the boundary between life and death had thinned, a place where whispers grew legs and walked in the dark. To speak Elisabeth Harrow's name was to invite her to your door, and so her name was spoken less, but never forgotten. As weeks turned to months, Agnes Harrow became the silent ruler of Ravenscroft. The family deferred to her judgment in all things, and the servants obeyed her without question, though not without dread. She was no longer simply an aunt mourning her niece. She became a keeper, a custodian of the house's terrible inheritance. Those who glimpsed her moving through the corridors of Ravenscroft spoke of her carrying bowls of salt from room to room, sprinkling it across thresholds and window ledges, muttering prayers under her breath. Some said her words were in Latin, others claimed the language was older still, something pulled from Cornwall's buried past. Whatever it was, it chilled the air whenever she spoke it. The villagers, already wary of the Harrows, began to speak of Agnes with particular fear. They said she was less a protector than a jailer, that the salt circles and whispered charms were not meant to keep spirits out, but to keep something in. Children who once mocked Ravenscroft with rhymes now avoided its gates altogether, crossing themselves if ever they had to pass within sight of it. Fishermen began refusing to cast their nets near the cliffs, insisting that the sea below the manor was cursed, that it gave back nothing but silence. Inside, the Avance saw stranger things still. Agnes ordered that mirrors be removed from every hallway and burned in the garden pit, claiming they were doors left open too wide. She instructed that no one utter Elisabeth's name after dusk, warning that to speak it aloud was to invite her into the room. When one young maid dared to whisper the name late one night, she was found the next morning with her hair turned white and her eyes wild with fear, unable to say what she had seen at her bedside. Agnes dismissed her the same day and forbade the other servants from speaking of it. Agnes also grew fiercely possessive of Elisabeth's chamber. She kept the door locked and carried the only key on a chain around her neck. Some servants said they saw her entering the room late at night with candles and bowls of water, staying inside for hours before emerging pale and trembling. When asked what she was doing, she replied only, "It is not her we fear. It is what may follow if she is left unguarded." The villagers began to believe that Agnes was no longer simply tending to the memory of her niece, but to the presence itself, feeding it with ritual, containing it with salt, and binding it with words none dared repeat. Ravenscroft became more than a house of sorrow. It became a prison. Its master jailer, an old woman who seemed to know that the Pale Bride of Ravenscroft had not gone willingly into the grave, and would not stay there without chains stronger than earth. By the autumn of 1863, Thomas Day had withered into a ghost of himself. His cheeks hollowed, his eyes sunk deep, and his voice carried the raw edge of a man who had shouted his grief too many times into the sea. Yet despite Agnes's orders and the family's disdain, he lingered still on the cliffs, refusing to leave Cornwall. Each night he watched Ravenscroft's black windows, certain that behind them his bride remained, waiting for him, trapped by rituals and silence. Villagers pitied him, but they also feared him, for his grief no longer looked entirely human. One storm-lashed night, when the wind howled through the chimneys like an organ, Thomas forced his way past the gates of Ravenscroft. The servants heard the pounding on the doors, the desperate shouts of his voice calling Elisabeth's name again and again. Some swore they heard an answer, faint and muffled, rising from within the walls of the house. Agnes ordered the doors barred. "He must not see her," she hissed, her hands trembling as she scattered salt across the floor. But Thomas would not be deterred. He circled the manor like a madman, beating upon windows, pressing his face against the glass, searching for the pale figure he swore still waited for him. When dawn came, he was found at the base of the chapel steps, collapsed upon the stones as though the night itself had struck him down. His clothes were soaked through, dripping as though he had been pulled from the sea. Yet the ground around him was dry. His skin was clammy, his lips cracked and lined with white salt, and his breath came shallow, as though he had drowned without ever touching water. The servants who found him dared not move him at first, for his hands clutched at the air as though holding tightly to something unseen. When he finally stirred, he whispered her name, soft, broken, and then fell silent. The villagers spoke of it as proof. They said he had been with her, that the bride had come to him in the night, drawn by his grief and his love, and that the sea itself had marked him as one of its own. He was carried back to the village, half-conscious, and though he survived, he was never the same. His hair grew streaked with grey in a matter of weeks, and he spoke little, keeping to himself, scribbling letters no one ever saw him send. Those who glimpsed him wandering the shore swore he still called out, though only in whispers now, as though afraid the answer might come too close. At Ravenscroft, Agnes ordered the chapel steps washed with salt water and barred Thomas from ever setting foot upon the grounds again. Yet she, too, seemed shaken, for her hands trembled as she gave the order, and her eyes, cold and severe though they were, carried the shadow of fear. Whatever had happened to Thomas Day on that stormy night, even Agnes Harrow knew the truth. Elisabeth had not rested. The Pale Bride of Ravenscroft had answered. In the months that followed, Ravenscroft Manor became a place no bride dared enter. Word spread beyond Cornwall of the tragedy that had taken Elisabeth Harrow, and with it came tales of what lingered still within those walls. Suitors withdrew their promises, engagements were broken, and even servants refused to remain in the house after dark. Ravenscroft had always carried a reputation for sorrow, but now it was branded openly as a place of death. Inside, those who remained spoke of disturbances that grew too frequent to dismiss. Footsteps echoed along the gallery at night, light and deliberate, as though the bride herself paced endlessly in her gown. Doors creaked open without cause, and more than once a servant swore she felt a train of lace brush across her ankles as she climbed the stairs, though when she turned nothing was there. Candles lit at dusk guttered all at once, smothered by a draught that no one could trace. The air inside the house grew colder, even when fires blazed in the hearth. It was said the house itself exhaled, a chill that pressed into the skin and rattled the teeth. Agnes Harrow doubled her rituals, but even she seemed strained. Bowls of salt were renewed daily, and iron nails were hammered into the thresholds of the chapel, yet still the disturbances came. One maid recalled waking in the night to find her chamber filled with the faint scent of lavender and salt, and the sound of soft crying pressed against her ear. Another swore she saw the shape of a bride standing at the end of her bed, veil drawn, motionless until the candle was struck, whereupon the figure dissolved into shadow. Within weeks, the maid fled Ravenscroft, never to return. The villagers, watching from a distance, claimed they could see candlelight moving along the manor's upper windows long after midnight, as though a procession wandered the halls. They spoke of music, faint upbeat, and strained, drifting across the cliffs, notes of a harp that had long since been covered. And they whispered that Ravenscroft was no longer a home at all, but a mausoleum for a bride who would not be contained by earth or coffin. Superstition grew so strong that neighbouring families refused to marry within sight of the manor. One bride, whose family had long been connected to the Harrows, is said to have refused even to pass by Ravenscroft on her way to the chapel. "No vows of mine," she declared, "will be spoken beneath its shadow." The carriage detoured miles inland, adding hours to the journey, but none dared argue with her. She was not the only one. Brides across Cornwall began to fear Ravenscroft's curse, as if it might stretch from its walls to their own. The Harrows withdrew further into silence, sealing rooms, shuttering windows, and barring the great hall. But the silence of Ravenscroft was no longer the silence of dignity. It was the silence of a house haunted by its own dead, a silence that grew heavier with every passing night. By the spring of 1864, whispers of Ravenscroft's unrest had travelled far beyond Cornwall. The story of Elisabeth Harrow's death, cloaked though it was in talk of fever and sudden collapse, had reached London, and with it came curiosity from those who styled themselves men of science. Among them was Dr. Jonathan Alderton, a physician of some reputation, known not only for his skill in anatomy, but for his fascination with the boundary between life and death. He arrived at Ravenscroft uninvited, carrying letters of introduction and a determination to see for himself the truth behind the rumours. The Harrows, fearing scandal yet unwilling to risk his public suspicion, admitted him. Alderton was given access to the chapel, where he examined the place of Elizabeth's interment. He noted the salt circles renewed each day and scoffed at what he called superstitions of the countryside. Yet what he recorded in his private notes told another story. Weeks had passed since the burial, but he wrote that the coffin gave off no odour, that the ground above it had not sunk as freshly turned soil should, and that when he pressed his hand to the stone lid, he felt a chill that seemed to rise from within rather than descend from the air. His words grew darker still when, through persuasion or bribery, he convinced a servant to show him what few dared. The coffin was opened in secret one night, though the family never acknowledged it. Alderton's account, later discovered among his papers, described Elizabeth's body as incorruptible. Her skin, he wrote, showed no sign of decay. Her lips, though dark, seemed soft still, and her gown lay about her as though she had been placed there only hours before. "I have studied death," he wrote, "and I know its progress well. This is no ordinary preservation. There is a force at work here that resists both time and nature. It is as though she lingers between." He urged the Harrows to permit further study, suggesting exhumation and examination under controlled conditions, but Agnes Harrow refused. She met him with eyes cold as the sea and told him, "She is not yours to study. She is ours to keep." Alderton, unsettled, returned to London soon after, but his fascination never left him. Among his belongings at his death decades later, the notes were found, sealed in a drawer, as though even he had feared what they might reveal. The villagers, of course, knew nothing of these records, but they spoke all the same of the coffin that never sank, of the chapel that stayed cold even in summer, and of the sense that Ravenscroft had not laid Elizabeth to rest at all. They said the house had claimed her, not the grave, and that no man of science could alter what the stones themselves demanded. After Dr. Alderton's departure, Ravenscroft grew darker still, as if the house itself resented any intrusion into its secrets. Whatever force lingered within its halls did not rest with Elizabeth alone, for misfortune began to spread like a slow poison among those who remained. The first to fall was a maid named Clara, barely 17, who had tended Elizabeth in her final weeks. She collapsed suddenly while sweeping the gallery, her broom clattering against the tiles. When others rushed to her, they found her lips tinged blue, her eyes wide open and fixed upon the ceiling. She did not stir again, and though the physician was summoned, he could offer no cause. Agnes declared it a fainting fit, an accident, and ordered her buried before nightfall. The villagers whispered otherwise. Soon after, a distant cousin visiting from London disappeared altogether. He had come to offer condolences, and perhaps to secure some of the Harrow fortune for himself, but one night he was gone without trace. His room was found empty, his belongings still in place, and the only sign of disturbance was a scatter of salt spilled across the floorboards, as though a bowl had been overturned in haste. Some said he had fled, frightened by what he saw. Others believed Ravenscroft had taken him, as it had taken Elisabeth. Even Agnes, the unyielding keeper, showed signs of weakening. Those close to her said her hands trembled more than before, and her once sharp voice grew hoarse, as though strained by endless whispered prayers. She was seen wandering the halls at night with candles, pausing at doorways as if listening to voices beyond. One servant recalled hearing her murmur, "She will not stay alone. She calls for others." When questioned, Agnes denied it, but the fear in her eyes betrayed more than her words. By then the house was nearly emptied of staff. Only a handful remained, those too loyal or too frightened to leave without permission. They moved through Ravenscroft in pairs, refusing to walk the corridors alone, and even then they confessed to hearing footsteps behind them, soft and steady, though no figure followed. Some swore they heard the rustle of a gown against the floor, a faint trailing noise that faded when they turned. Others claimed that when they carried lamps at night, the light dimmed as though smothered by a veil. The villagers no longer doubted. They said Elisabeth's spirit, bound by salt and ritual, had grown restless. She was not content to linger in silence, not content to be the bride who never wed. She called out for company, and those who heard her call did not escape unscathed. Ravenscroft had become a place where the living and the dead walked together, where each day felt like the prelude to another burial. And though Agnes fought to contain her, even she could not deny that the Pale Bride of Ravenscroft was gathering strength. By the late 1860s, Ravenscroft had begun to empty. Once a symbol of Harrow pride, the manor became instead a fortress of silence, its corridors echoing with absence. Servants departed one by one until only a skeleton staff remained, and even they refused to linger after dusk. Doors were barred, rooms sealed, and whole wings of the house left to rot in darkness. The great hall, once prepared for Elisabeth's wedding feast, was locked and never opened again. Dust and cobwebs gathered over the garlands that had been hung in celebration, a banquet frozen in death before a single toast could be raised. The chapel, too, fell into disuse. The villagers who once braved its cliffside path now avoided it entirely, claiming that the ground there had grown wrong, that the air inside was so cold it burned the lungs. Its doors were locked, its windows clouded with salt residue, and its altar stood deserted. Only Agnes continued to visit, carrying bowls of water and sprigs of heather, whispering prayers no one else dared to hear. She alone kept the rituals, as though her will alone could bind the pale bride within her coffin. Yet even she seemed to know that Ravenscroft was slipping beyond her control. The Harrow family itself fractured under the weight of fear. Some members fled Cornwall altogether, settling in London or the countryside, determined to sever themselves from the manor's reputation. Others grew sickly and withered, plagued by nightmares they could not name. Within the house, Elisabeth's name was spoken less and less, until it vanished from the lips of her kin entirely. Even the family Bible, once meticulously kept, showed no record of her birth or death. Pages had been torn or blotted, erasing her from the line as though she had never lived. But absence was not enough to silence her. The villagers whispered that on certain nights, when the moon hung low over the sea, they still heard her crying carried on the wind. Some swore that candlelight flickered in the gallery, moving from window to window as though a procession walked behind the glass. A few even claimed that her veil could be seen fluttering from a shuttered window, a white spectre in a house of black stone. In time, Ravenscroft became less a home than a husk, its doors barred to visitors, its gates rusting on their hinges. It stood on the cliffs, like a monument to sorrow, abandoned by the living, but not by the dead. Elisabeth Harrow had been erased from her family's records, but she had not been erased from the house. Ravenscroft still carried her, in its stones, in its silence, in the restless breath of its corridors. To those who watched from the village below, it seemed certain that the house was waiting. For what? They did not dare to imagine. Even after Ravenscroft's halls had emptied and its doors had been sealed, the presence of the Pale Bride refused to fade. Travellers along the Cornish coast continued to tell stories, each eerily similar, each spoken with the shiver of those who had seen what they could not explain. They spoke of a pale figure drifting along the cliff edge, her gown trailing behind her like a stream of mist, her veil fluttering though the night air was still. Some claimed she walked barefoot, her steps leaving no print upon the heather. Others swore she did not walk at all, but hovered just above the ground, her form wavering like a candle flame in a draught. Fishermen feared the sea below Ravenscroft most of all. For while the waters along that coast were notoriously violent, the sea beneath the manor cliffs grew unnaturally calm. Waves that raged further down the shore would flatten into silence there, as though the ocean itself paused to listen. Nets dropped into those waters came up empty, or worse, tangled with strips of white fabric stiff with salt. The men refused to cast near Ravenscroft after dark, for they claimed the bride could be seen standing at the cliff edge, watching, waiting, her face obscured behind the veil that no wind could lift. At night, when the wind was low, villagers reported hearing bells. The chapel had long been closed, its ropes cut and its doors chained, yet still the sound of tolling drifted across the fields. Sometimes it was a single peal, sometimes a mournful procession of three. Always it came when the moon was heavy and low, and always it was followed by silence too deep for nature. Those who dared approach swore the sound did not carry from the tower, but from beneath the earth itself, as though the bride rang her own funeral bells from her coffin. There were even those who claimed to have glimpsed her within Ravenscroft's windows, though the house had been abandoned for years. Pale candlelight would bloom in the gallery, flicker across the panes, then vanish all at once. A figure in white would be seen standing there, hands pressed against the glass, as though pleading to be let free. And always, without fail, the sea beneath the cliffs would flatten to glass when she appeared, its waves stilled as if awaiting her command. To the villagers, these were not simply ghost stories. They were warnings, reminders that Elisabeth Harrow had not gone willingly into the grave, and that Ravenscroft was no ordinary house of sorrow. The Pale Bride lingered, tethered to stone and sea, bound by rituals of salt and silence that had failed to contain her. The living might have turned their backs on her name, but the dead remembered, and the dead do not forgive so easily. In time, the villagers' whispers were joined by another source of unease, the letters of Thomas Day. Few were ever seen, for most were hidden or destroyed, but a handful survived in the possession of a parish priest who claimed he could not bring himself to burn them. They were fragments only, yellowed with damp and blotched with salt, but their words carried the desperation of a man who had seen too much and been believed by none. The first letter was written in trembling hand. I know what they tell me, that she lies beneath stone and earth, that her coffin is sealed. But I have seen with my own eyes the light in her chamber, the shape of her veil in the window. She is not there in the ground. I cannot be convinced otherwise. They have hidden her from me. Another, longer and more frantic, spoke of Agnes Harrow directly. She guards the door as though it conceals treasure. She tends to the salt as if it were her own blood. What she keeps in that room is not memory but presence. Elisabeth has not been given to the grave. She has been bound here. The most disturbing fragment was addressed to the priest himself. I beg you, Father, believe me. The coffin in the chapel is a lie. I know it now, though I am half mad with grief. She is still in her gown. She still breathes in the house, though not as the living do. I have heard her beyond the walls, her steps across the gallery, the whisper of her voice. If this letter finds you, you must act. The salt does not hold her. It holds me. It holds all of us. The priest, too fearful to confront Agnes directly, kept the letters locked in his desk. But he admitted in later years before his death that he believed Thomas's claims. I think she was never buried, he wrote in his own journal. I think they left the coffin empty to appease the village, while they kept her still inside the house. I think Ravenscroft has never let her go. Whether Elisabeth's body lay beneath the chapel or within the walls of the manor, none could say for certain. The Harrows themselves gave no answer, their records silent, their mouths sealed. Yet Thomas Day's conviction never faltered, even as he wasted away in grief. Those who saw him in his final years described a man who spoke less and less, who walked the cliffs alone at night, staring always toward Ravenscroft, lips moving in silent conversation. To the villagers, he was a man tethered not by love, but by a curse, as bound to the Pale Bride as she was to the house. And so the legend grew darker still. If Elisabeth Harrow had never been given to the earth, then the curse of Ravenscroft was not the story of a restless ghost, but of something far worse. A bride who had never left her gown, and a family determined to keep her hidden. As the years dragged forward, the Harrow name began to wither. Once a family that commanded respect and fear in equal measure, they became a dwindling line overshadowed by whispers of their curse. Some members, shamed by the events at Ravenscroft, abandoned Cornwall altogether. They sold what lands they could and fled to London or the countryside, hoping distance might sever them from the shadow of the Pale Bride. But wherever they went, the stain of Ravenscroft followed, a story that clung to their name like a burial shroud. Prospective suitors recoiled at mention of the family, and alliances that once might have been secured by marriage dissolved into nothing. Who remained at Ravenscroft did so not out of pride, but out of necessity, for few dared buy or inhabit the estate. The walls grew damp, the roof sagged, and the windows darkened with neglect. Whole wings were sealed off, left to rot. Only a handful of Harrows stayed within its halls, their health failing, their fortunes dwindling. Some became reclusive, seen only when Agnes ordered them into the chapel for yet another of her vigils. Others simply wasted away, consumed by the oppressive silence of the house. Agnes herself remained the unyielding heart of Ravenscroft. Though age bent her frame and whitened her hair, her authority never faltered. She continued her rituals with unwavering devotion, sprinkling salt, covering mirrors, and locking Elisabeth's chamber with the key she carried always about her neck. The villagers said she no longer left the manor except to tend the chapel, where she prayed alone for hours. Her presence grew spectral even in life, her black figure moving through the halls like a shadow among shadows. And then, without warning, she was gone. One winter's morning, the servants found her chamber empty, her bed unslept in, the key to Elisabeth's room resting upon her pillow. No carriage had been summoned, no farewell spoken. Her disappearance was complete, and no trace of her was ever found. Some believed she had finally succumbed to the sea, drawn over the cliffs by the same force that had claimed her niece. Others whispered she had gone willingly into Elisabeth's chamber and locked the door from the inside, giving herself over to the very presence she had fought to contain. From that day forward, Agnes's name ceased to appear in any record. No burial stone marked her passing, no parish register recorded her death. It was as though she, too, had been erased, folded into the silence of Ravenscroft. And with her absence, the house stood more desolate than ever, its keeper gone, its secrets unguarded. The Harrow family dwindled further, their lineage fractured, their fortune lost, until at last Ravenscroft itself stood abandoned. But the villagers knew better than to call it empty. For even without the Harrows, the house was not uninhabited. After Agnes's disappearance, Ravenscroft became a wound upon the cliffside, a husk of stone no one dared claim, yet no one could ignore. The Harrows who remained sought to rid themselves of the place, putting it up for sale in 1871. But though the estate was advertised as a grand manor with fertile lands and a commanding view of the sea, no buyer would take it. The villagers' whispers travelled faster than the ink of the advertisements, and the name Ravenscroft carried with it a chill that no fortune could outweigh. Yet there were those curious enough to step across its threshold. A solicitor from Truro came to survey the property and was found hours later stumbling into the village, pale and trembling. He refused to speak of what he had seen, save for one broken statement: "The mirrors are breathing." Another man, a surveyor sent from London, lasted only a single night within the manor. He fled at dawn, leaving his belongings behind, claiming he had heard a gown sweeping across the floor of the gallery and the sound of weeping just beyond his chamber door. He swore that when he opened the door, the weeping did not cease but moved further down the hall, always just out of reach. One couple, believing the tales to be nothing more than superstition, attempted to purchase Ravenscroft as a summer home. They left within a week. The wife was seen in the village, her hands trembling as she clutched her shawl, muttering that the bride stood at the foot of their bed each night, veil drawn, never moving, never blinking. Her husband denied it at first, but when pressed, he admitted he had seen her too. The sale was abandoned, and the manor returned to silence. Even caretakers hired to maintain the grounds did not last. One reported finding the great hall prepared as if for a wedding feast, candles lit, silver laid out, chairs drawn neatly in rows, though no one had entered the locked room for years. Another claimed he found a length of veil nailed across the chapel door, stiff with salt as though placed there to bind something within. He quit his post the very same day, refusing to ever set foot upon the grounds again. In time, Ravenscroft's reputation grew too fearsome to challenge. The advertisements ceased, the estate left to rot upon its cliffs. The villagers told their children to keep away, and travellers along the coast were warned never to wander near after dark. Yet still, candlelight was seen in the upper windows, moving as though someone walked the gallery, and faint bells were heard tolling from the chapel. Ravenscroft could not be sold because Ravenscroft was never empty. It remained inhabited, though not by the living. The Pale Bride had seen to that. Years turned into decades, and still Ravenscroft stood, black against the Cornish cliffs, its silhouette sharp as a gravestone against the horizon. The Harrow name dwindled into obscurity, but the Pale Bride remained, her story whispered from parent to child, tavern to chapel, until it was no longer just a tale of one family, but of the coast itself. The villagers said the house could not crumble because it had not finished its work. Stone by stone it endured, clinging to the cliff like a relic of grief, and those who passed beneath its shadow swore they felt eyes upon them, watching from windows that had long been bricked shut. The sea below remained as strange as ever. Sailors charted its unnatural calm, a patch of water that resisted wind and storm alike. To drift across it was to feel the stillness of a tomb, a silence so deep that even the oars seemed to hesitate. Those few reckless enough to approach claimed they saw her there, the bride in white, standing at the cliff edge with her veil spread wide, as if ready to leap. Yet she never fell. She only stared, unmoving, as though waiting for something, or someone. As the years passed, her name grew forbidden once more. No gravestone bore it, no parish record marked it, and the Harrows had struck her from their line as though she had never been. But legends are not erased so easily. Children still sang the rhymes, their voices thin and cruel in the lanes. Travellers still asked about the manor, and the villagers still shivered before answering. And when the night was windless, and the sea lay flat as glass, they still swore they could hear a faint tolling from the chapel, bells ringing for a wedding that never was. Some claimed she was bound forever in her gown, The lace turned into chains, the veil into a shroud she could never remove. Others believed Agnes's rituals had trapped her soul within Ravenscroft's walls, binding her to the salt and stone. And there were those who whispered that she had chosen to remain, that she had embraced her fate as part of some bargain too terrible to speak aloud. Whatever the truth, no one doubted that Elisabeth Harrow had not left. The pale bride lingered still, a shadow upon the house, a warning upon the coast, and a reminder that some debts are never paid, only endured. Even now Ravenscroft stands. Its windows gape hollow, its doors rot upon their hinges, but the house is not silent. Those who dare draw near say they hear the dragging of lace across the floors, the soft weeping of a bride denied her vows, and the faintest sound of laughter, brittle and broken, slipping through the cracks of the stone. Ravenscroft waits, and so does she. And if you find yourself upon the Cornish cliffs on a still night in June, you may hear the bells tolling again for the wedding that never was and the bride who never left. If you've listened this far into the forbidden tale of the Pale Bride of Ravenscroft, you are one of us, a keeper of secrets history tried to bury. Before you go, subscribe to the Macabre Record channel so you never miss the next unearthed story. And tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from, because darkness has a way of reaching everywhere.